welcome everybody to this talk, which is the last in our Dune Heritage and Culture series. I am Emma and I'm from Dynamic Dunescapes. We are a life and heritage fund, so National Lottery Heritage Fund funded project, and we are working to restore 7,000 hectares of sand dunes along the English and Welsh coasts, making them better for people and for nature. And this November, we have been doing a series of talks celebrating the history and the heritage of our dune systems, and maybe opening up some doors that people haven't really explored before and looking at some different topics. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a talk from Jonathan Woolley, who is a social anthropologist and behavioural analyst at DEFRA. And he did his social anthropology degree, PhD even, sorry, not a degree, at Cambridge University. So he is absolutely the guy to speak to about spirituality in nature, especially when it comes to our UK coastlines. So I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, and then if you have any questions during this talk, please do pop them in the chat, as we'll do a Q&A at the end. And if you've got any questions, just whack them in there and we'll do that at the end. Brilliant. Jonathan, I'll let you take it away.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's an honour to be invited here today to present on on the role of the relationships that pagans have between the relationship that pagans have with our coastlines, and a little bit of context as well about the pagan community. So ultimately, I think one of the sort of key points I'd like to introduce today is that the sort of pagan community in the UK have a very specific kind of relationship with the environment and a very specific relationship with landscape, and dunes and coastal environments are no exception. And I would argue that there's actually quite a lot that wider society can learn from this relationship. And so I think it's well worth being mindful of that, because pagans experience a wide variety of different sort of structural barriers that make engaging with the landscape and make their kind of their practice in general more difficult in certain ways. And so I think it's actually really useful for greater understanding of the pagan community to be achieved more generally. This is actually based on an internal presentation I did for DEFRA to sort of help policymakers understand the nature of nature-based spirituality in the UK, but I'll also be touching a little bit on the specifics of the relationship that that pagans have with sand dune type ecosystems in particular, as I go through. So I've already been introduced, so this is a slide that kind of summarizes the information you've already been given. My PhD was indeed from the University of Cambridge, and in the course of my studies I did 14 months fieldwork in the Broads National Park, including quite a lot of coastal ecosystems, plus an extended period of fieldwork around that 14-month period with British Druids and Dowsers. The main focus of my research was actually on sort of people's the relationship of land managers of different types with the landscape. So not just focusing on pagans and practitioners of nature-based spirituality, and that was the result of that research was published in 2020 by Routledge. But I do feel that spiritual relationships with land can actually tell us an awful lot and are really interesting. So my central kind of questions that I take particular interest in are how English people connect with the landscape and how cultural attitudes and ideas influence the management of the landscape specifically. And so my interest in the pagan community is partly contextualized by this broader interest that I have in how English culture and the English landscape like co-produce each other. So I'm very happy to sort of talk through that. So my first sort of point that I'd like to discuss today is why does nature-based spirituality, including paganism, matter in general? And I'll be talking a little bit about that relationship with coastlines that I mentioned earlier as well. So I think the first point is that public sector organisations in particular, but I would argue society in general, has a responsibility to and an ambition to promote equality and inclusion within British society. And it's important to be aware that people who follow nature-based spirituality, and I'm glossing that as pagans here, although pagan is a word that has many different definitions and there's many perspectives on what that means. But the key point here is that people who practice nature-based spirituality, who identify as pagan, face quite significant structural barriers to participation in public life more generally. And that can include their relationships with protected landscapes as well. And what's more, pagan ideas and practices represent an important yet under-acknowledged aspect of British relationships with the environment. So the way that the way that pagans engage with their wider landscapes is actually a real source of strength and inspiration that I would argue can actually has more broader relevance to the way in which we all seek to live with and preserve and enhance the landscapes in which we live. And these are kind of the 2 points that I'm going to be exploring in the context of this presentation, because essentially, in order for society in general to kind of understand the important contribution and to experience the benefits of the important contribution of pagan ideas and practices, some of the structural barriers to participation will need to be addressed, and I'll talk a little bit about how that can be done. So firstly, to set the scene, talking about who Britain's pagans are, and you can see some symbols of different pagan faith groups there on the right-hand side of the screen. According to the 2011 census, some 84,661 people identified as pagan in the United Kingdom. But it's thought that the true number is actually somewhat higher. And the reason for this is because in order for someone to identify as pagan, there's no actual sort of baptismal or conversional process. It's just something that we don't really have an equivalent ceremony for that within pagan traditions. Instead, most pagan traditions involve initiation of some description. Now, in terms of the amount of work and the amount of effort and the amount of time it takes to undergo an initiation, that's roughly equivalent to ordination in let's say a Christian community, or indeed to become ordained as a monk, let's say in Buddhism, for example. So when you consider that 84,000 or so people number reflects broadly people who have made a real sustained, there's no sort of cultural paganism in the UK where people would identify themselves as pagan simply because they go along to the summer solstice and mark their membership with their faith a couple of times a year, which is quite different to Christianity in this country, where there is the phenomenon of cultural Christianity, where people's engagement will be somewhat less and will still identify as Christian. Because you don't see that with the pagan community, I would say that 84,000 or so number reflects the number of people who have essentially chosen actively to become ordained, as it were. So with that in mind, it indicates the fact that there's actually a much broader network of people. Ronald Hutton, a very prominent historian of paganism, actually says it might be around 250,000 people back in 1990, and it will have grown significantly since then, because we can see the number of people who are essentially ordained pagans growing significantly over that same period. What that means is that we have therefore a much larger number of people who might have some kind of interest or involvement in pagan spiritualities, but haven't necessarily chosen to undergo ordination. So, for example, this would be someone who maybe reads the horoscope every week, that might be written by a pagan in a local newspaper, or someone who goes to get the tarot read, or someone who marks the summer solstice every year. Like, that level of engagement is probably equivalent to the level of cultural Christianity as we talk about it. But because we don't have within pagan traditions a kind of a baptismal ceremony, there isn't something that there isn't a ritual process you go through for conversion. So people don't tend to identify as pagan if they're engaged at that level. But that gives you a sense of why that number perhaps underemphasizes the number of people who are interested and involved in these spiritual traditions. So with that caveat, It includes a really broad range of different spiritual traditions, and each have their own distinctive practices and cosmology. So they range from, for example, the northern tradition, which is sort of which involves the reverence of Norse deities like Thor or Thor or Odin, all the way to sort of Druidic traditions which honor deities like Riganthona or Angus or Bridget. So, and includes things like Wicca, so various forms of religious witchcraft as well. But what unites all these different traditions, in addition to their sort of in the kind of primary sense, is that they share a common conviction that the divine is strongly present within the natural world. And as a result, the British landscape itself is sacred. And something else that also binds these traditions together is a common sort of interest in looking at our cultural heritage as a source of spiritual inspiration and guidance as to how we can engage with the sacred in the landscape. So that might be an interest in folklore, it might be an interest in local fairy stories, it might be an interest in traditional rites or practices, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. This common conviction, though, that I mentioned, also supports a belief in the importance of the divine feminine. And an acknowledgement of plurality in the divine more generally. So some pagans might experience that in terms of animism, so interaction with lots of different spirits, whereas others might engage in a more kind of polytheistic way, or so worship of many deities, or they might just worship one deity, but see that deity as present within all of creation. So beyond these informal initiatory traditions that I've mentioned, so these traditions that you initiate into in order to become one of that 84,000, but there's very little ecclesiastical structure. So there isn't really a church, there isn't really congregations, and therefore most practitioners are pretty autonomous and work as solitary practitioners or in small groups. So there isn't really a big institution of paganism in the UK. And there's also, therefore, also means that primary sources of divine truth include customary practices, as I've mentioned, folklore, but also things like personal revelation. So if, for example, you have a dream of a particular, has certain spiritual resonance, people might draw on that for spiritual insight. And also omens made visible through the natural world. This might mean, seeing a meaningful pattern in the flight of birds, for example. So but that's all very kind of like a textbook definition, but what is paganism ultimately like? So pagans, basically the key focus for most pagans is a seasonal sequence of folk festivals, which vary depending upon the pagan tradition that you're in, but most of them are tied into the changes in our natural environment that unfold over the agricultural cycle. So if you look at the Wheel of the Year, which is a mapping out of one set of pagan festivals, you can see that there are some, like Samhain, for example, was the time of year, 1st of November, when livestock were traditionally slaughtered before the winter. So all those livestock that you couldn't feed over the winter and didn't need to kind of keep your herds going next year were slain, and the meat was consumed as part of a big feast to celebrate the passing of the year. Imbolc is the beginning, is when lambs or rather when lambs start showing in their mothers, and when ewes start to give birth. Beeltenor is when you take the herds up onto the summer pastures and you need to purify them ritually before they do so. Whereas Lunasa is a celebration of the beginning, of the end of the wheat harvest, and it's like a big summer fete which brings together the herds and where people go when they want work from different. It's like a big festival where people go to find work, etc. The big summer fetes happen around Lunasa time, and that is a key. So when the harvest is finished, people come together to celebrate. So there's a key connection between the Wheel of the Year and these sorts of agricultural festivals. But there's also a really big importance for things like divinatory practices, such as meditating to seek visions, and also spells and other forms of rituals to sort of nudge the outcome of fate is also really important here. There's a major focus on cultivating wisdom, creativity, and honoring spiritual beings. And you can see that as we'll look at in a second, that these things are have a really close relationship with the kind of folk practices that link us to our heritage landscapes. And you can see some examples here along the bottom. So like a rowan berry garland, for example, which is a traditional protection against enchantment by fairies. And similarly, a horseshoe turned upside down to kind of ward off bad luck. And all of the kind of ceremonies that pagans get involved with tend to draw on these sorts of folkloric symbols and practices to create a kind of spiritually meaningful experience for those who practice. So this is just a kind of quick overview of the importance of our coasts and seas amongst pagans. And you can see here that on the right hand side of the screen there, 3 different pictures which kind of symbolize, which kind of give you a sense of some of the ways in which some of the sites on our coasts that become very significant in a pagan context. So pagans in Europe have viewed liminal places as sacred for thousands of years. And as I say, they tend towards an animistic worldview. And those are the 2 things which really ensure which really kind of inform the importance of coastal areas for pagans. So the sea is one of the 3 planes of existence in Druidic cosmology and has an enormous amount of significance within pretty much all pagan traditions, and is for Druids considered to be an abode of the dead. And that means that the coast is a liminal place, which basically means that it's a kind of an edge between one place and another, a bit like a door lintel or a crossroads. And as a result of its liminality, the coast is very sacred and is a real focal point for spiritual practice. And its importance, at least within Druidry, becomes particularly important at 2 times of year. One is Orban Heffen in the summer solstice, and the word Orban Heffen means the light of the shore, and also at Orban Elved, which is the autumn equinox, which is the light of the water or the light of the sea. And so those 2 times of year are often when many Druids go to the sea or go to the coast in order to celebrate the cycle of the season. And the reason why those 2 festivals are particularly associated with the sea and with the coast is, as I mentioned, those places are the abode of the dead, that the sea is the abode of the dead. And so as the sun starts to, as the length of the day starts to shorten towards the festival of Samhain that I mentioned earlier, that festival specifically which is just immediately after Orban Elved, is associated with the dead and associated with honouring the spirits of those long past. So, in a way, the festivals leading up to it, Orban Heaven and Orban Elved, have this role of almost giving you this journey away from the growth and new life at the beginning of the year in the spring towards the kind of the very gates of the underworld, which open at Samhain, which is the next festival after Orban Elved. So there's a kind of sense with which you're sort of through the sequence of Druid festivals I mentioned there, that you're sort of traveling from the world of the living into the world of the dead to meet them at Samhain before you return again by the winter solstice. The other thing to note about the sea is it's also the abode of many different beings, from sort of mythical creatures like selkies to very real creatures with a lot of sacred symbolism like the salmon. And all of these beings are revered by pagans and considered to be sacred and important in their own right. And therefore, the sea will often be the object of reverence, and as those animals are indeed revered. And as a result of that, the sea will play a key role as a venue for certain spells and rituals. There are many spells which require you to go out to certain coastal areas in order to practice them. So a good example of this from folklore is a rather gruesome ritual, which is quite important within East Anglian witchcraft, whereby one seeking occult power will go and find a natterjack toad, which lives in sort of sandy environments, and then put it in essentially bury its body in an anthill, and then recover the bones a little while, I think it's a month later. And then you cast the bones on a flowing stream under a moonlit night. And if one bone floats against the current, that is your toad bone, and that is the source of occult power, and you can use that to cast all sorts of spells. I'm not, of course, saying that any pagans actually do this now, because Natchak toads are protected, but it's that kind of symbolism which gives you a sense of the kind of spiritual relationships that pagans seek to form and engage with in order to link with those spirits that live in the seas and live in the landscapes coastal areas. So yes, I think the key thing here is that our coastal islands play a role of being sacred sites for pagans. They essentially play the function of a church, and we use them as a space to connect through ritual with beings who we care for and feel deep affection for. There are some sites there on the right-hand side. You can see Stonehenge at the top, which is a domain of the ancestors, which was revealed by the tides a couple of years ago now, which is viewed as having quite significant sacred significance due to its link with our deep past by pagans. There's a statue of King Arthur there at Tinpadgel, which is a little island on the edge of a coast, and down in Cornwall, and that also is a place which is a site of considerable reverence for British pagans, as is the Ring of Brodgar, which you can see at the bottom there. So these are all different landscapes, some rocky, some muddy or sandy, and they all have this important role as being a liminal place where druids go to seek the help and support and kinship of other than human beings who dwell there. So now, I think this is just kind of to think about some of the barriers that pagans face when engaging in public life. So the reason why this is, I think, important for thinking about sand dunes and the heritage connected with them is that these barriers can actually make it difficult for pagans to make use of some of these sacred spaces in nature that I've mentioned earlier. Most pagan forms of spirituality have actually been heavily suppressed in the United Kingdom. So both by the church and by secular authorities in the UK. After all, the Witchcraft Act, which banned all forms of witchcraft, was actually only repealed in 1951. There's still widespread suspicion and even bigotry about pagan spirituality, ranging from outright hostility, where people think it's immoral, to viewing it as silly or unserious, and sort of just taking the mickey out of it. And the other point is that I think that the forms of heritage that pagans are most invested in, so rituals and folklore, actually enjoy no legislative protection in the United Kingdom. So a sand dune might well be protected, but the stories or the customs that might be associated with it would not be. And that's because tangible heritage, like physical objects and locations, are much more heavily valued under UK legislation. Also, as I mentioned earlier, pagans don't have a church or churches. So there's no real institutions to represent their needs other than the Pagan Federation, which is a sort of a membership group that I'll mention in the next point. But most spaces dedicated to supporting pagans have actually been set up as small businesses or small voluntary groups, which don't actually have many resources to marshal. They're quite dependent on volunteers, and that means they're very vulnerable to wider economic conditions. So in periods of austerity, a lot of them have had to close. And those organizations that do exist, like the Pagan Federation, which I just mentioned, were all created relatively recently and have very limited funds. And they also have faced quite significant legal hurdles to getting registered. So the Pagan Federation's charitable status still hasn't been recognized. Pagans do not benefit from large endowments, and they don't have there is no large international pagan community to offer patronage or funding to help with the creation of new institutions. And they also don't have historic influence that other faith groups, like the established church in the UK, can actually draw upon relatively easily. So as a result of all this, pagan perspectives are frequently underrepresented or unrepresented in consultations and public policy making, and indeed the decisions that are made by any organization. And what that can mean is, let's say, for example, a group of pagans find a particular cove or area of coastline as being of sacred significance. Their relationship with it will often be quite informal, and it won't even necessarily be made. They won't necessarily even make themselves known to the organizations responsible for managing that site. And so decisions could be made which might make their worship difficult or even impossible without them being consulted or engaged upon in the normal way. that should mean other organisations, not DEFRA, but DEFRA could learn as well. And that is that the key point I want to make here is that pagans can act as custodians for Britain's intangible cultural heritage about nature. But they do so on an entirely voluntary basis. So indeed, in many situations where people who organise ceremonies or efforts to try and maintain our cultural practices, these people are quite often pagan. So you've got some examples there. You've got wassailing. You've got I did try and have a look for some things that were more sand dune specific, but I'm afraid I ran out of time. And you've got the opening ceremony of the London Paralympics there, and the people involved in these sorts of ceremonies behind the scenes are often pagans, and are keeping alive key elements of our traditions and folklore. A key point about the London Paralympics, you can see the green man in fire there. There was actually I know two people who worked on that specific aspect of the ceremony, and they were themselves pagan, but also the actual liturgy part of the script for the Paralympics opening ceremony was actually drawn from a Druid ritual. So we have like this kind of hidden influence on the cultural life of Britain. But as I say, it's provided on a largely voluntary basis. The key thing I want to make about this, though, is that this cultural heritage doesn't just belong to pagans; it belongs to everyone. And it's really important that that the policy and the work that organisations do around rural locations and rural landscapes can draw an inspiration from these aspects of our collective heritage. That's very much my personal view. It's not DEFRA policy, but it's certainly something I personally feel. And pagans represent also, and this is worth remembering, pagans represent a highly environmentally motivated sector in society who might help environmental organisations meet their strategic objectives. So it's worth remembering that if you're looking for like a very engaged constituency who are very passionate about the natural world and encouraging it, pagans are a viable group. So I think there's also a point here that there's quite a lot of evidence, so Robin Wall-Kimmerer is a particularly eminent author in this space, that we can find from cross-cultural comparison that intangible cultural heritage of the sort that pagans really celebrate is a powerful tool for connecting people and nature. Many Indigenous societies have a very deep understanding of their natural environments, and this is mediated through both technical means, so knowing lots about their local ecology, but also through cultural means as well, so through ceremonies, through stories, through songs, etc. But since the 19th century, nature connection in the UK has reduced, both in terms of the amount of time we spend outdoors, but also in terms of the breadth of the connection. So now a lot of the time, many people only connect with nature in a very economic way or in a very aesthetic way. So they either are a tourist or they work on the land. There's no broader kind of cultural reference point that they're drawing on. Anthropologists have argued that ritual is a powerful means for changing behaviour. So this is within the broader anthropological evidence base. And my research showed that customs celebrated by pagans have actually mobilised them to take pro-environmental action. So many English people have ingrained biases about these different approaches to nature, but what if we tried to learn from them instead? What if we didn't view sort of spells and ceremonies as being kind of silly or superstitious, but instead recognize the fact that they can have powerful psychological effects that might be beneficial for the environment? So that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully that's been very interesting. As I should definitely add as an important caveat, nothing that as I've said on the slides, nothing that I've mentioned here is actually DEFRA policy. This is simply drawing on a sort of a presentation I did internally on the kind of importance and the contribution that paganism could make to making a public policy. But I think these lessons are also, or the evidence supports these lessons also being valuable for a broad range of different organisations engaged in environmental work. So I'm very happy to have shared those insights with all of you. It's based primarily on my knowledge of, as an academic, on the evidence of the importance of nature-based spirituality. But I would, so with that caveat in mind, I'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have.